First of all, welcome to Washington, Michael. Michael and I have been friends for many decades.
That's right.
And our association goes back to the Water Commission, Consultation on Church Union, a variety of venues. I am not the type of person that likes to give lengthy introductions because in Michael's case, the introduction could go on and on and on. He has many ecumenical achievements. He has been a professor, author, writer, and so I'd like to simply say welcome and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to be with you this evening. I appreciate very much. The consortium has, I should say, I've touched on the consortium at different points in my life and ministry, but only somewhat distantly. I gave the Takmanji lecture in 2010. Had a chance to be with some colleagues at that time, but not had a chance to meet some of you, and so I appreciate this very much. I want to congratulate Larry and to also pray God's blessing for your ministry in this role with the consortium. And allow me also to say a special word about another person or two around the room. Ecumenism is about relationships, so it seems right that we also name some of the relationships as we begin. And John Ford is not only a longtime friend, but a blessing to the ecumenical movement. All of us here know that. His work on Faith and Order has been so valuable that we even have the Fordian method that we continue to use in the National Council of Faith and Order as a result of John's contributions. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be introduced by you. I look to his left that Michael Root is a scholar with whom I've had a chance to work, but also to teach his works over the years. His work with the bilateral conversations on other topics of faith and order concern has been very important to me. So I appreciate that. Could go on down with Clark, has been a colleague in interfaith work and through a conference that I'll refer to in just a moment. Appreciate that. And certainly Ron working with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the National Council of Churches. So deep appreciation around the room, and I wanted to name that because you are a gift to one another. I work with Tom and with Mitzi over the years. And next to them is my pastor I'd like to introduce, Reverend Dr. Mike Bledsoe, who is the pastor at Riverside Baptist Church. Some of you know I'm kind of identified with the disciples over the years, but I began to go to this church because it's a minute and a half away from our apartment building in the southwest quadrant. And what I discovered is the most extraordinary little congregation led by an outstanding preacher pastor. And so he is my pastor, and I'm very pleased to invite him to come with me tonight. But beyond that, Mike has completed 20 years at this church, has taken, a couple of weeks of sabbatical during that time. And so he's going on sabbatical in May. Including to Rome. And so I had a chance to be in contact with Bishop Farrell, and the Pontifical Council staff will meet him. And I think it's fair to say that ecumenism wasn't what you majored in. Is that fair over the years? So this will be a chance to make up some ground. And then allow me to say a special word of greeting to my friend Gabi Habib, who is a longtime colleague in the work of the Middle East, and for those who don't know, former General Secretary of the Middle East Council of Churches. So during the discussion time, I hope you'll say a word about perhaps your work with Middle East Christians in the United States, but also I was saying to him at dinner about His Holiness Pope Shenouda and some of the issues involved in ecumenical life in the Middle East. I think that's of interest to all of us. So again, thanks very much for the chance to be with you. Larry suggested that this be an informal time. I've not prepared a formal manuscript, a time when I would introduce themes that we might engage in conversation around, and I'd like to do that, but also to introduce some resources that we might find of use together. And I'll begin with a personal word. As you may know, I was General Secretary of the National Council of Churches until the end of December of this past year. And at that time, I stepped aside for health reasons, so that no one has to ask. I'd had a heart attack and 9 stents in the last 4 years, and my cardiologist suggested that 70% of the time on the road was not good for my heart. Imagine that. So I stepped aside from that and am in a period of kind of a severance sabbatical for these 6 or so months here in Washington, D.C. My wife and I moved here last October, and I'll come back to that in a second. But you might want to ask later on about the National Council of Churches. It obviously is dear to my heart, and that may be a topic that we'll want to raise, including the last major trip that I took for the National Council last December was to Cuba, where the National Council has strong ties, especially with the Protestant community, and with the papal visit to Cuba beginning on Monday. That may be something we also would want to talk about, and some of the ecumenical relationships on that island and the relationship with us here in the United States. So I named that as one of the topics. Before becoming General Secretary, I had been a seminary professor for 25 years at 3 Protestant seminaries in this country, including dean for a decade at the Lexington Theological Seminary in Kentucky, where we were part of a consortium of schools like this one. I'm getting round to this as another topic we may want to raise. That consortium was very interesting because it included St. Meinrad, Catholic, of course, school, but also Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I was there at the time when it was in the transition to fundamentalist control, if I can put it that way. Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, Asbury, which is conservative Methodist Wesleyan tradition, and Lexington, which is disciples, my own tradition.
And I graduated from Louisville Presbyterian.
You graduated from there. Well, I'm coming to tell a bad story about you in just a second. One of the things we tried to do as a consortium was to have a course on ecumenical dialogue that was consortium-wide. Now, I don't know if you've tried such things here. If not, would that commend itself to you? But I throw it out. I proposed this to the deans. They all said yes. Then it came time for registration. Nobody registered from Asbury. This was not a shock. At Lexington, I think we had 8. From St. Meinrad, I think there were half dozen, which was really quite good because they had to travel a couple hours to Louisville for the sessions that we were having. From Louisville Presbyterian, nobody registered. And when I asked the consortium student representative why, she said, well, everything we do is ecumenical, so there's no need to do it intentionally. This is an obvious issue for all of us. Seminaries think that they've fulfilled all righteousness by being interdenominational and then don't teach about the movement and about our intentional work at receiving God's gift of unity. Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, they cut off enrollment at 30 and told me they could have had 3 times that number. Now, part of the reason is they're larger, but the main reason was it was costly. Because the students who were showing up for this course were defining themselves in some sense over and against a convention which was saying no to ecumenism. I think this makes a difference. They were in that period where this helped to say who they were theologically, and so a costly ecumenical commitment. I still remember that very much. In any case, so that's an issue you may want to raise about consortia and what you can do together ecumenically. But what I want to announce this evening is I'm returning, as some of you now know, to theological education. We'll be teaching starting this fall at Seattle University, which has a school of theology and ministry within that Jesuit university. That school is fully accredited by the Association of Theological Schools for ministerial training for Protestants, and there are 10 Protestant denominations that are affiliated with it. I'm very interested in this experiment and to see how that kind of teaching goes on in that sort of a setting. I like very much being in relation to Catholic colleagues. I may not make the same kind of journey that Michael has made, but as he knows, I have Catholic tendencies that this certainly speaks to my own heart to be in that kind of a setting. One of the things I like very much, though, about this school is that they are identifying themselves as a center of ecumenical and interfaith life in the Seattle area. They're the only mainline seminary going, but the councils of churches of Greater Seattle and of Washington State have fallen on hard times, and so they don't want to take the role of the council, but the school clearly sees itself as working with the councils to help build up ecumenical life. I find this very interesting, and I'm interested to see how that works in the Seattle context, and I raise it for you here also. You may want to speak about that. When I was at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis, there was no council of churches in the city, and so we partnered with Aquinas School of Theology and the Interfaith Partnership, which is a similar organization to what Clark leads here, in order to become a sort of center of interfaith, especially life in St. Louis. So, for example, and I throw this out as another thing you may want to talk about, in 2004, we developed together, as Muslims, Jews, and Christians in particular, religious principles for an election year. We hammered out 10 propositions grounded in our faith commitments that spoke to our understanding of the kinds of issues that were at play in the election. Took out a full-page ad in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, published it as an open letter to the community, and then held a series of seminars at the seminary and at Aquinas on how to speak civilly about such issues in the public arena. Now, I don't know if that's possible in this sort of a setting or not, but I throw it out again as one way in which another seminary has worked to lift up its own ecumenical profile. Right now, as I mentioned, I'm on a kind of sabbatical, and I'm working on a book that I'll say a word about in just a moment. But I also want to mention that an anthology of the ecumenical movement that I published in 1997, and I know some of you have used it in various settings, that I co-edited with a former student of mine, Brian Cope, is now coming out in a new edition. So as of May, there should be a new edition of the ecumenical movement, an anthology of key texts and voices with about 75 new texts. And having taught it over the years, I don't know how Michael and Mitzi and others have found this, but I found that the short text didn't work well for teaching. And so we've eliminated the snippets and put in fewer but meatier major statements. 75 new ones. It's being translated right now into Korean, also in preparation for the World Council Assembly that will be next year in Busan. So I'm excited to see it come out, and I mention that because it may be of interest to you. The other volume that I'm working on right now is a collection of essays that grow out of speeches and articles that I've given or written over the last few years on ecumenical and interfaith themes. Just finished one this last week, for instance, on how the Orthodox can help others understand them better. So I try and name 5 misperceptions that many of us who aren't Orthodox hold about the Orthodox. I didn't learn these from Gabby, but and the ways in which the Orthodox contribute to those misperceptions by some of the things they do. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to do in this collection of essays. I hope to have about 20 of those and to finish it by the time we head west. So I hope that these will prove useful, and that's a shameless plug, but I wanted to mention those as resources that you might find of interest. One of the texts that we didn't get into the anthology, but I spent all day today trying to get it in, to see if they could still squeeze it in, is a new text on mission and evangelism, which is being prepared for the World Council Assembly next year. It's entitled Together Towards Life, Mission and Evangelism in Changing Landscapes. And even as we talk now, a group of 200 is meeting in Manila to go over this text for the 12th time now. It's in the 11th draft at this point. So I commend it to you also, especially those who are teaching mission or ecumenism and mission as a text to take a look at. I don't know about you, but I find that things hot off the press are often most interesting to teach, because you can really wrestle with them in kind of the same way that those people are doing now in Manila. So take a look at that. You can get it online through the World Council site. Last month I was in Lebanon for an international consultation on councils of churches. This is the fourth in a series since 1971 of national councils and regional council leaders who gather to talk about what's going on in their settings and what are common problems and how they might address them. I'll tell you, by the way, that the number of participants was 50% less than in 1971, in part because there are that many fewer national councils of churches, or they can't afford to travel. So that itself is a bit of a downer, but this was the fourth in that series, and I went to present a paper at that gathering. I would like to talk a little bit about lessons that I learned at that meeting, a place near and dear to Gabby's heart, as well as a meeting that Clark and I attended this last weekend that was the National Association of Ecumenical and Interreligious Staff. It's called NACE. It's a gathering of professionals in ecumenism, especially at the local level. So local councils of churches, interfaith and ecumenical are the colleagues there. So if you'll allow me, I'll start our conversation by naming 5 themes, I guess, that surfaced for me as I thought about those 2 meetings over the last month. One, councils of churches at the global level, the other, councils at the very local level here in this country. These themes may not be terribly surprising to you, but sometimes it helps to name them aloud, and it'll give us a chance to begin conversation. That sound okay? That's great. I'd hoped this would be appropriate for the gathering here. The first one is the most basic and in some sense the most obvious, and that is a loss of commitment to the goal of Christian unity. When Cardinal Koch was here in the fall, was that October? November. I very much appreciated the presentation that he made at Catholic University, and during that, you'll remember one of the powerful moments was when he spoke about his pain at the fact that so many other Christians weren't feeling pain these days about the divisions of the church. This was simply corroborated in both of these meetings that I've been in over the last month. I hate to tell you that, but I think it's important for us to name it. Faith and order, as a set part of the agenda, has dropped out of state councils of churches across the country. There are some that still hold on to faith and order Christian unity commissions, but fewer than has been the case in the past. And that's also true of many of the national councils of churches who were gathered in Beirut for this meeting from around the world. Local ecumenism, Clark can correct me on this, but I think it's fair to say local ecumenism, talking about councils of churches now, they would call themselves that, is entirely a matter of practical cooperation. Almost no focus at all on Christian unity. Local councils, in many cases, are quite vital, I have to tell you. The Council of Churches in Binghamton, New York, or the Council of Churches in Tacoma, Washington, are both bigger in terms of staff and budget than the National Council of Churches in this country. And that's true in several places. The reason for that is that they have government contracts to do direct service on things like housing and so on, which we wouldn't have through the National Council. Nonetheless, it's a bit surprising to people to realize that in Tacoma, the budget is larger and the staff is larger than in the National Council of Churches in the United States. But those councils will almost never have a focus around Christian unity, and in many cases were simply disdainful of it in conversations that I had over the last weekend. These are good colleagues. I love them. They do great work. I celebrate the work that they do, but there is no interest in the classic ecumenical agenda. I finally asked a good colleague from Binghamton, very fine man, do you understand yourself then to be part of the ecumenical movement? Yes, of course, he said. In fact, he was quite dismayed that I would ask such a question. Raises real issues for us about what are the contours of that movement. Along with that, I'll add almost a bit as a footnote that some of the churches historically committed to the work of Christian unity have now shifted their focus so much to diversity and particularity that unity has also almost dropped out of the picture. I think here of the United Church of Christ, which I'm very close, but they now speak of themselves as a multicultural, anti-racist, inclusive church, but never ecumenical, despite the fact that John 17 is on the logo. This is a concern, I think, for all of us to name those who are concerned about this movement and committed to it. Now, all of this contributes as well to a misunderstanding of and a weakening of councils of churches. This is Conciliar Ecumenism 101, so forgive me for repeating things that you already know. But the essence of a council of churches is the relationship of the churches to one another. It is not their relationship in an office in New York or Washington, D.C., or wherever it happens to be. But try telling that to the leaders of our churches, either here or overseas. I went blue in the face trying to speak to the National Council about the fact that I would say to the leaders of the churches, you have not joined an organization. You have made a covenant with 36 other churches in order to live out something of that unity which is your gift in Jesus Christ. But they tend to think of the council as a cooperative agency of the churches, and the more that unity is diminished on the agenda, of course, the more that notion of conciliar life also falls away, as you can imagine. This was a major source of conversation, as you also would imagine, at our meeting in Beirut. Accountability was the theme constantly said by my colleagues in other parts of the world. The churches are not accountable to one another. And this is at the heart of the problem that they would experience as councils. Back in 1971, they prepared for that meeting by having Victor Hayward, who was the secretary for councils of churches in the World Council, visit almost every national council of churches in the world. We don't have the budget to do that kind of thing anymore, but he visited 80 to 90 national councils. And at the end of this, he wrote a memo to Eugene Carson Blake, who was then General Secretary, in which he said that where there is commitment, it's commitment to the council as institution and not to the other members in it. And thus his conclusion was that councils of churches are, generally speaking, ecumenical facades behind which the churches remain as unecumenical as ever. In fact, in many cases, they have said, yes, we're ecumenical because we leave it to that council, rather than claiming the accountability that goes with a commitment made to one another. I'm interested in whether Gabby finds this in his own experience as General Secretary in the Middle East Council or your own experience in other settings. That was a major theme of our time together in Lebanon and a major concern of colleagues around the world. This is a kind of concomitant point to this first one. Along with this diminished commitment to the unity of the church goes a failure to hold together or in tension the various streams of the ecumenical movement. One of the reasons that I like working in councils, I so appreciate someone like Michael who helps me stay informed with the bilaterals, but I like councils because that's the place for me where faith and order, justice and advocacy, mission and evangelism, education, often forgotten, but education and renewal come together in some kind of structured way. But of course, as you can imagine, that's less and less the case if Christian unity isn't held in high esteem within the life of the council. So councils are often accused of being places where political agendas get played out because they're overly concerned with justice or advocacy issues, and thus are played off against some of the bilateral concerns. You can see this coming up this coming week. One of the reasons I mention it, you can see it this coming week here in Washington, D.C., when 900 ecumenists will gather for ecumenical advocacy days. How many of you will be participating? Desiree will be going. So this is a gathering I love very much, which does hill visits and education around major justice and peace themes that are really central to the ecumenical agenda. I think it's fair to say that the people who gather there think of themselves as at the center of the ecumenical movement in some real way. A month later, 200-300 will gather for the national workshops on Christian unity with a very different set of agenda items around promoting the visible unity of the church. Tom goes. Others of you probably go to the national workshops as well. I think it's fair to say that when we gather there, think of ourselves as at the heart of the ecumenical movement. And I can name on one hand the persons who go to both. It's telling to me about kind of the fracturing of the movement and a sense of the breakdown of some of its wholeness. I felt that very much in the gathering with colleagues in the Middle East. Second of the themes that I wanted to name is the importance but also the difficulty of interfaith relations in this day. Right now I'm working on the third of the chapter for this book, and it's on the challenges that go with interfaith relations. I think we kind of take it for granted, and we're going through a period of euphoria of initial contact in some ways in the United States. But interfaith work is extremely difficult, as you know, and I think we're going to come soon to a period, hopefully, of greater maturity where we'll face some of these challenges more directly. But at our meeting in the Middle East, all hell broke loose when we tried to deal with interfaith relations. The Europeans and North Americans were all saying this must be a central part of the agenda of a council of churches. But from Nigeria and parts of the Middle East, not so. Because they would say, of course, this is something we live with, but we live with it in a situation of violence and tension. And therefore, especially colleagues from Nigeria, also from Indonesia, began to speak very strongly about conversion-oriented evangelism, and that interfaith relations should not be higher on the agenda than that. And that we needed to deal with the issues of violence that attended the conflicts between Christians and Muslims before we began to commend interfaith relations as a part of the agenda. As you can imagine, very difficult to try and deal with these tensions. Again, Gabby can speak to this much more fully than I. But of course, the Christian communities in the Middle East have had very ambiguous relationships with some of the rulers that we now find problematic in the American press. I met with President Assad in Syria not 3 years ago to say thank you to him for the way in which he had, in some sense, helped protect the 6% minority of Christians in the country and had received 1.5 million refugees from Iraq, many of whom were Christians. While the United States had received, 7,000 Iraqi refugees. So you can imagine that the Christian community also lives in some real tension with the current Arab Spring and with, of course, a lot of issues going on across Africa. This came home in an interesting way in Lebanon also because I brought up a writer, a Lebanese writer who's been very important to me, Amin Maalouf. He has written, he's a well-known novelist, The Rock of Tanyos, you may know some of his novels, but he also has written a book called In the Name of Identity. And you can imagine why identity is of such importance to him. He is a Christian, Arab-speaking, Lebanese writer who lives in France and writes in French. So all of the questions of identity that he tries to raise. Well, in the ecumenical movement, I think it's fair to say that we've tried to emphasize Christian as the fundamental identity marker which defines us and therefore relativizes all of the secondary indicators that we've used to divide us. You are Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians. You understand how that has given us a kind of common ground to speak about our life together in Christ. Maalouf will have none of it coming out of the Lebanese situation. I'll read you only one quote. What has to do with religion must be kept apart from what has to do with identity if we are ever to stop feeding fanaticism and terror. So in that context, identity looks very different. I suspect that identity will be a major theme on our ecumenical agenda for some years to come. But we need to listen to international colleagues as they also speak to us about the ways in which that cuts differently than it does for us. Number 3 is the need for and the hunger for ecumenical formation. I'm not simply saying that because I'm gathering here with those who are engaged in theological education. It was a major theme that surfaced somewhat surprisingly in Lebanon and also at the meeting over the weekend at Nace. In Lebanon, the constant refrain was the churches are not providing ecumenical formation and therefore the councils must step into that breach and do far more of it than we have been. I would have to say at the National Council of Churches that if I had to name the one biggest regret I had as General Secretary, apart from not finding another $1 million donor, I guess, it was that I did not engage in real ecumenical formation with the board. I took it for granted that we had persons who were formed in an ecumenical sensibility, and that simply isn't true. So this was raised over and over again at the Beirut meeting. It was also a major complaint at Nace, but there the complaint was that seminaries aren't doing it. All of you took it on the chin. We had Rebecca Tollefson, our good colleague from Ohio, do you remember, stood up and she said, I want to know why it is that all the people you turn out from seminary don't know beans about the ecumenical movement and are completely insensitive to it. Now, you can say that's her experience in Ohio and it isn't here, but I suspect you know what she's talking about, that many people do graduate from seminaries that we know, if not ones we teach in, without deep knowledge of this movement or sensitivity to other traditions or ways of engaging with neighbors of other churches and other faiths when they get out into ministry in the congregations. And so this was named very strongly there, and I lift it up again for our reflection. We may want to talk about it here later on. Number 4 is the need for the ecumenical movement to be reconceived as a place where difficult issues are addressed. That came up almost in those terms. Really just in that phrase, overseas at the meeting in Beirut. I thought very much of an essay by Mark Heim that he published in the Christian Century about 15 years ago, a colleague of ours on Faith and Order over the years also, in which he said that the movement has dealt with issues that are now relatively easy for us. And we tend to sweep under the rug those questions like human sexuality, for example, which have proved to be most neuralgic. Why isn't the movement itself the place where we can really deal with those kinds of questions? This was reinforced in many of the discussions overseas. The man who was in charge of Christian churches together in Britain and Ireland, this is a body that has the same characteristics as Christian churches together here in the United States. That is, they work by consensus, church leaders are major players in it, said that what we have become, this is his language, is a community marked by polite parallelism that avoids contentious issues. I think the only way to really deal with that is to affirm the given unity of the church, which isn't dependent on our agreement and therefore allows us to stay at the table even when we disagree about major questions, but that didn't happen much in the National Council. I tried to force the issue on sexuality after the vote in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and got no takers at the governing board, having alerted the ELC colleagues that I was going to do that. We simply avoid those sorts of questions, and therefore the ecumenical movement is not a place where we really deal with what are today major divisions. And then the fifth one is more a question than it is a trend. But my question coming out of NACE over the weekend is, aren't there trends we shouldn't accommodate? The NACE meeting, I don't know if you felt this, Clark, seemed in love with sociology. For instance, we learned that 50% of the public in Washington and Oregon is spiritual but has no use for the church. And therefore, the immediate conclusions we were supposed to draw is that we had to accommodate our agenda, either as school or as council, to this kind of sociological data. My goodness. I almost wanted to scream in the middle of some of this conversation. I remember about 2 months ago, I heard Roseanne Cash, isn't that her name, as the daughter of Johnny Cash, say on National Public Radio, being religious isn't a team sport. Well, for Christians it is. Church is at the heart of the gospel. We don't relinquish this for sociological reasons. We rather teach what it means to be church in ways that now speak to a different generation. Yes, of course. And all this needs to be perhaps taken into account, but not accommodated. Very interested to hear your thoughts on this also. Faith and Order of the World Council has been dealing with a text on the church that's been called The Nature and Mission of the Church, but that text has now been scrapped, and a new document simply entitled The Church is being tested. I don't know if you I got a copy of this for review in the last month. It's not very good yet. We're in real need of speaking powerfully together, and that's why I appreciate Stasia's work on ecclesiology. And wish you all the best on that. This is at the heart of the movement. We need to reclaim that at the center of our life together. And by the way, this mission text they're debating now in Manila does have a very strong emphasis on the church at the heart of God's mission. Part of the reason for that is that leaders in the mission work of the World Council have become a little disenchanted with Missio Dei, with simply the emphasis on the mission of God, and are trying to recover more of a sense of the mission of the church, but not simply for the sake of planting churches. So, interesting to watch over that. A second of these is a constant refrain at NACE, is that our people have little interest in theology. Well, too bad. As I see it, the real problem in this movement right now is that if I had to name the biggest challenge that we face, it's the loss of theological depth in so many of the participating churches. It's hard to be ecumenical if you don't have a sense of how this arises from the gospel, rooted in scripture and tradition. So again, this is not a trend that I want to accommodate. One of the persons I didn't mention when I was going around the room is a visitor who's here with me, as I am, and that's Gene Patrick, who's straight back there. And I want to mention that Jean comes from a church that I've come to appreciate, and also makes a point that I want to make. She's from Christian Science Church. I have found that Christian Science, because of its heterodoxy, has really challenged some of the theological life within the National Council. But Christian Science folks are also experiencing, you can correct me, Jean, on this, but a kind of energy that comes from having been isolated and now breaking out into the horizon of dialogue. And so a tradition which has been singular in its own theological reflection, focused on Mary Baker Eddy, now wants from me a reading list on theologians we should be reading in order to deepen our understanding of sin and atonement, which are the two things I told them they were most out of line with orthodoxy.
We all awake.
Something exciting about this to me. Mitzi knows we've got with Shirley Paulson on Faith and Order, and the gifts that she brings there. In any case, theology clearly has to be at the center of what we're about. It's the excitement around theology which gave the movement impetus. Part of that may help explain then why I so appreciate the things that you do, either as students or as professors, and why I'm glad to be with you this evening. Hope that helps to begin some possible areas of conversation for us.
Hallelujah, hallelujah.